gonna take a second just to calm down.
Yeah.
Been asking questions for years, but I still get nervous.
Yeah. I mean, the question is, so you just take your time, like I'm not asking you to think or respond to anything, but the question is who is the one that gets nervous? So it feels like there is a Brian inside the body that is a continuation through time. So I am Brian, and I have a story. I was at school, I studied, I grew up, I had parents, I became an adult, I'm a certain age. And that Brian now, in this moment, exists as this timeline, and now feels nervous asking questions. Whereas actually what's happening is nerves are appearing for no one.
Yeah.
And then there is a questioner that is, or a thinker that is claiming the nerves to be somebody's, whereas the nerves are appearing for no one in this infinite space. It doesn't really appear inside of Brian. When there's thoughts are there, it can say, okay, the nerves are in the stomach, which is appropriate to be able to name it. But in the direct moment of them, the nerves are everywhere and belong to everything.
Yeah. That's wild.
Yeah, it is wild.
So that was actually kind of my question. I just want to like feel if what I'm saying is going to be true for me. Um, so yeah, the question is actually about the story of Brian. Um, so sometimes when there's this story of Brian, it seems like there's a letting go happening simultaneously. And it's almost like something can let go of the story or drop the whole thing. And it feels like, I mean, it can feel really blissful, um, but also, I guess, terrifying. Um, but that's just part of the story. That's the same suffering entity. Um, so
Yeah, yeah,
my
totally.
questions, yeah, and it's all seeking. Like the other day, I was just like sitting watching like a stream non-related about like gaming or something, and there was like this indifference that like started arising. Like, oh, I just don't care like about the pleasure and the non-pleasure and like and at first I was like, well, that's just psychological Brian being out of sorts and not being balanced or something. But then it just kind of continued, and at some point it just felt like bliss. Like I just don't care. And um
Yeah, what can
so
be
guess
happening? What
yeah.
can be happening in that moment is I don't know. So this is projection, and I might be wrongly diagnosing what you're talking about. I just say that because I don't want to be, like pushing my opinion onto anybody. Like it's really your own
Yeah.
investigation, your own going in, and their own conclusion. Even though it's nobody's conclusion, it's like coming to that energy's conclusion. But my
Yeah.
diagnosis on it, my opinion on it would be that in that moment, the seeking began to dissipate.
Yeah.
The seeking is the energy which is holding up the story of Brian, holding up the story of you. And as that began to dissipate, there became, it's not a disinterest in what's happening, it's just a lack of investment like there is before. Like when the seeking's there,
Yeah.
everything is about you and what you're going to get in the future. So everything in a way does feel less pleasurable. But then as
Yeah.
that begins to go, then immense bliss and freedom can arise. And that too is an effect in life. Like really what's
Yeah.
happening is a presence is overtaking, and then the bliss arises as an effect of that, because it is very blissful in the world of things. But there's a coming home to the stillness of what you are.
Yeah. And also the bliss is seems to be like a form of suffering. Um, or like the attachment to it.
And the attachment to it, no feeling is is suffering as such. So no feeling like bliss or happiness or sadness or anger. None of them are inherently suffering. They, it's the always the belief that that is who you are and that they belong to you that creates suffering. I mean, that's the way I verbalize it. But other people speak in other ways. It's that energy which is, I am blissful, I am angry, I am hungry, and it's like an ownership of experience. Whereas who is the one that could possibly own experience? There is simply what's happening, the stillness of what is, where everything is appearing and disappearing into, for nobody and for nothing. And this is the truth, this is the freedom.
And I can't think of anything else except to ask stupid questions because in a way all questions just seem kind of stupid. But this Brian story, and it seems like in that story there was like a lot of suffering and just exhaustion with the suffering. And then um I can't remember exactly what I was gonna say. But anyway, like how's that story? How could that story, not that I could do it because I clearly can't let go of. How is that relinquished? That's life's doing.
Just like everything else is life's doing. Like, how did you start you? How did you
Yeah,
begin you? Like, how did you start
I didn't.
Brian? How do you in the morning wake up and become conscious of the world? How do you think? How do you make the heart beat? How do you make the light shine or breeze blow? It's a happening. But anything that Brian thinks is his, there is a narration and an energy which is claiming that to be his.
Yeah, I can feel it. Like I can feel it coming in and like it like hears your words and then tries to take ownership of it.
Yeah,
It like yeah, it's like collecting or something or like interpreting.
yeah,
And it's like it's like a compulsive like addiction.
yeah,
And like behind that, it feels like there's just like silence, like watching it.
yeah, which is who you are. So there's not somebody that's looking at this silence behind it and looking at Brian and knows the difference. What you are in this moment is the experiencer, which is silence.
Yeah. So it's okay that there's this like indifference almost like towards the character, like
I don't know about that. That could be
yeah,
some screwed up personality dynamic, or that could be like freedom. Like, I don't know on that level. You have to investigate that with someone.
yeah,
I don't want to like say, yeah, it doesn't matter about this thing or this thing, because I know now from working with people for so many years that people use every story they can to maintain
yeah.
themselves and maintain their dynamics. This is really talking about a stillness with no thought, no dynamic, no knowing, no idea of what you're going to be in the future. It's really a spontaneity that's coming from now.
Mhm. And it's death.
Yeah, and life. So
I,
happening and not happening.
and there's like the sense that I'm like in a way this could also be a personality dynamic, but that I'm walking around um but like already dead
Mm.
and like still
That could be depression, you know. I don't want to really go into that, not just
yeah,
because of you, but because of people listening, you know, and that
yeah,
could easily fit
I
into.
see.
But it is like Walking Dead, but not in a depressive way, not in an
No.
emotionless way, not in a cold way, in a free, loving, expansive way. Like this comes with love. So if it's dead with just emptiness, that's not it. It's also the other side of it is absolute love.
Yeah, so there's like immense joy sometimes when there's like that total letting go and just like happiness and then well the character is kind of imbalanced so like if if there's like identification with it then it's painful but there's like in the background there's like a fear sometimes like what happened like am I already dead or something um and that's like this I guess I don't know fear of like the silence like
Mm.
um but it really it doesn't matter it's all stories it's all BS it's all like mm, it does seem like there's something that's become really clear and that's a um that and this I mean this could be a, you know perceived as a personality dynamic but it just seems very pretty clear that everything is suffering um and there's one way not like there's one way not to suffer and I don't want that to sound depressing for
Everything is suffering. Everything is suffering uh, because
but holding
if
on
we say the opposite to that, like when everything is free, when
yeah yeah
when
that's it
you are free, when there is freedom there, then everything is free. When there is suffering there, then everything is suffering because we can only see what is being experienced. So if there is suffering in that human character, then everything is suffering. And when there is freedom in there, then everything is free.
yeah and what's the suffering belief like I try to investigate and a Course in Miracles has really helped me with this is just like seeing clearly what the suffering is made of. I don't know, that doesn't sound right. But what's the core belief of this suffering? You know, because when the suffering's happening, I try to look at it.
The core belief is I I am somebody. I am the body. That's the core belief. I am a body. I as something exist. Rather than just being I am, like a live presence, it is I am a body. I am somebody.
Yeah. And that arising, there's just nothing to be done about that. Like it's not something, it's not like a problem to be fixed.
That's a very simplistic way of saying it, which I'm sure is you trying to summarize what teachers are saying. But it's not like doing happens. So it's not that nothing's to be done about it, it's just that doing is happening. So if there is a doing about it, that's absolute perfection. But there's not somebody there that would do something about it. Who would do something about it? There can be a narrative of I am doing something about it, but in every moment, life is happening. There is the movement of the arm. There is the thought to go meditate. There is the thought to investigate who am I, but that isn't somebody who's doing. So it's not that there is nothing to do about it, because that would be the opposite, as there is something to do about it. It's that life is a happening. And it's just stepping out of the way of yourself, letting life happen.
Yeah.
And that could be healing techniques, that could be therapy, that could be investigation. That's beside the point. It's not doing something, it's seeing that the one that's assuming it's the doer is a lie.
Mm.
Is a lie.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really true.
I'm just checking to make sure that our audio is working.
Mm.
Yes, there could be that there's a horrific echo for everybody. You know, it could be that I have to wear my
Oh
earplugs.
God.
I'm not sure.
Gotcha.
It seems to be working. No one's complaining.
Mm.
So in that, like me doing all of that, that happened. But I'm using pronouns as if it sounds like I am checking, but it just happened. So it's not doing something, like there's nothing to be done. It's that there is nobody that does something. Doing happens.
Yeah.
Impulses happen. And it gets seemingly changed, although it can't really be changed, when there is a claimer of action, because the action becomes more complex. So when there is somebody that's claiming an action, then there becomes lots of other thoughts about the action in which is claimed, just like, you know, if a fish jumps out of the water and land then and falls onto to land, then it flips and flops trying to get back into water. It's like life happens in the appearance of cause and effect. So if you start
Mm.
thinking that you are doing, so if there is an energy there which is I am doing, then the thoughts will follow in accordance with that. And the thoughts will become very complex and more than likely will create uncomfortable feelings because they're a lie. They're not true. They're out of line with the flow of life because there is no doer. It's like a tree believing that it has to grow its branches. And then it's like why isn't my branches growing? Why aren't my leaves blooming? Why isn't my fruit giving? And it starts getting really complex and like developing all these complex thought patterns around it. And then when it does grow through, it's like, oh, well done, tree, blah, blah. And then it has complex thoughts around that. Whereas it's happening.
Yeah. I I know that you probably prefer not to talk about like personality dynamics, but it seems like the core apparent belief of like this like ego is like guilt and shame. And maybe a lot of people have that in a way. Um, but
Yeah.
that's where the identification like
This is,
hooks
this
me.
is yeah, this is what Ramesh, Balsekar, and Roger taught. And I think it's a really beautiful teaching. So when there is doership, so when there is the claim of doership, then there's five dynamics that arise. Although I think Roger has six now, but when I was with him, it was five. So it's pride, shame, guilt, blame. So those two are in partners, so they're the opposite. So shame and then pride, so they oscillate between the two. Blame and guilt, they oscillate between the two. And then expectation was the fifth one. And you go between all of them, and then you'll have more resonance with some of them.
Yeah.
And they arise from identification. I believe personally that they can also arise without identification, but they will be very ghost-like, so they won't have much grip. So that's my experience of them, and it's important to, if you've done something inappropriate, to have a sensation of guilt, but it's nobody's guilt. It's a very thin, hollow thing. Whereas when you really believe you're the doership, then it becomes this very exaggerated, intense feeling, which produces lots of immense thinking and contemplation and debating and just all this heady energy that's telling all these lies of what's not true. There was action that appeared,
Yeah.
and somebody that feels ashamed for the action. And depending on the personality type, there might be more relating to shame. So if you didn't have certain parents in childhood, then there might be more shame that arises with certain things. So the shame might be exaggerated, whereas for others, it might be less so because that wasn't aggravated in childhood.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like the sense that I get from it is where it came from. It's just that apparently I think, diving into like the traumas and like sitting with this stuff is that the core of it seems to be like I wasn't held as a baby enough or something. So I
Yeah,
just didn't have that like human, and that I think it seems to have everything else seems to be based on that.
yeah.
Um,
Because in a child mind, so in a very young child mind, the safest thing you can do is blame yourself for that situation. Because if you blamed your caregiver, even though it's not a logical thing, it's not a baby there blaming the
yeah,
caregiver. If the baby did blame the caregiver, then you would be in dire strait because as a baby, you're 100% dependent on the caregiver. So therefore, the wise thing, even though it's not wise, but the wisest thing in that difficult situation is to take the responsibility of lack of care onto yourself. And
yeah,
therefore, and then what happens in that personality is then that personality blames everything. So if you see a child, I don't know, maybe two or three, they can go through a stage where they take too much responsibility for things because they can't see anything outside of themselves, which gets all muddled up with non-duality, but it's a normal process of the brain. So they kind of like go through this egotistical state where they think everything is about them. So everything good or bad that happens is about them. And
yeah,
then when you have exaggerated shame, it tends to be that state has never faded because, or that state becomes very strong because it was the safest option. Blaming the caregiver and saying, you're not giving me enough care means the death of you. It's that would be really scary to be that vulnerable. Like if you imagine like now having a car accident and not being able to look after yourself, not being able to walk, not being able to talk, not being able to go to the toilet, and being that vulnerable, and then perceiving that your caregiver can't care for you. The safest thing you could do
Yeah.
is blame yourself for the situation, and then therefore you don't actually venture into the idea that the caregiver is to blame. And then personalities are made up around this. The
Yeah.
shame, like the center point of the personality, and then the seeking dynamic makes whole lives around this. So then everything becomes really stressful for that person. So often, if someone has immense shame, they find dealing with daily life very difficult because they end
Yeah.
up becoming a perfectionist. I have to be the perfect person there is because otherwise everything is my fault. If I choose the wrong curtains, then everything is my fault.
Yep.
Whereas, like, rather than just having the ability to realize that you've chosen the wrong curtains and it doesn't really matter that much, it just is like so important and the mind can become obsessed with it. If I say the wrong thing, then everything is my fault and,
Yeah.
that other person
Hmm.
feels terrible because of me. And so therefore
Yep.
everyday actions become very difficult because there is so much shame and seeking around not feeling shamed. Shame is an
Yeah.
incredibly difficult feeling. And so it's identification with the person and then the baby not having good enough caregiving in the first few years and then blaming everything on themselves, taking all the responsibility for everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And it plays out again and again, and a lot of some of the things I've heard from you now, they're really good to hear because they're new, but a lot of these patterns I've seen and I just like watch them play out and like I mean what I do about it is because I don't want to go into like hopelessness, it's just to try to hold that child and to be compassionate
Yeah, lovely.
with
That's
that child.
yeah, that's it. That's really
Yeah,
the other thing you can do is move the attention into I am or move the attention into
yeah,
consciousness. And I'm not saying do one over the other. It's good to recondition yourself as well. And
yeah,
when it's lighter, you can move your attention into consciousness or I am. But when it's heavier, then imagining that is really healing in the character level to
yeah,
go and recondition the child and recondition that child wound. And I think that's what a lot of therapists would use to not
yeah.
the
And
into beingness, but to give compassion to that child. And just noticing that tendency for hopelessness and that that isn't true too. Because that's
yeah,
also what the shame person will do is to collapse into hopelessness. Like everything is my fault. I can't
yeah,
do this. Because of course you can't do this. You can't make life perfect. So of course that by the time you're an adult, you feel hopeless because you cannot perfectionize life to never feel shame.
yeah. So it's just it really is just trying to perfect things so that it doesn't have to feel shame. It's just so almost all the seeking is a lot of the seeking is concentrated around just avoiding this one emotion. And I try
It's
to,
avoiding that one emotion being you. So it's the I am the body, and then the identification with I am the shameful person.
yeah. So I try to sit with this feeling, uh, you know, with this childlike feeling sometimes. And what it feels like is, other emotions I open to them and maybe they flower somehow and then they let go or something, or I can let go of it. But this seems like it feels like a bottomless pit. And it's like I can't really yeah, I can only be with it, I guess.
Mm.
But, you know, and I like what you said though about like the I am and like because if when I take this story very seriously, it's um it makes it worse, but when it's just like seen like more lightly, um yeah, I don't know. I don't want to go more into this. Yeah. I mean, the intuitive sense is like it's not true.
It's not true. Nothing matters.
That's so wonderful.
It's the same person, like everything. When the shame comes up, like everything matters.
Yeah, yeah,
Nothing
yeah,
matters.
yeah, yeah.
Is.
Yeah, that's very freeing. Okay, well, thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.